President, Mr. Robert Donnelly. Welcome, I would say welcome back to the committee, Mr. Donnelly. It was good to see you on the St. Patrick's Parade this Saturday in the streets of Quebec City. I see you don't wear your green hat this morning, but
not every day.
It suits you like a glove on that particular day. Welcome also to Ms. Sylvia Martin-Laforge, which is the Directrice Générale of the organism, as well as the co-chair of the Youth Standing Committee, Ms. Nicola Johnston. So without any further comments, I would invite you to proceed with your speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blaney, and thank you once again for members of the committee. Welcome once again. I'd like to begin today by briefly summarizing our community's experience, obviously, with the Official Languages Act. That's the point of the meeting. I would like then to move on to how some of those experiences have impacted the English-speaking community of Quebec and some of the barriers to our collective vitality and sustainability. Finally, I would then ask the chair if I could pass over the speaker's chair to Nicola, as you already introduced, as the chair of the QCGN Youth Standing Committee. All this in 5 minutes. For the benefit of new members, please let me begin by describing the English-speaking community of Quebec in just a few words. A lot of myths about surrounding what is exactly English-speaking Quebec. Many continue to conjure up images of wealthy, white, Christian Westmount elite who spend their vacations in Georgetown. The reality is that we are the most diverse of Canada's official language communities. 23% of us belong to a visible minority, living as a minority within a minority, with all the social and economic consequences that implies. And like other official language minority communities, ours is an aging and declining at an accelerated rate compared to the majority. Also, like Canada's other official language minority communities, we experience high levels of out-migration. Another challenge for our community is the assumption that English speakers have ready access to arts and culture. However, the omnipresence of American generic electronic media does not reflect the experience of our community and cannot be counted on to tell our stories in our voice. The Language Arts Network, ELAN, who's a QCGN member, is trying hard right now to make that point with the CRTC. It is not on CNN, on NBC, or even on City TV from Toronto that we will see stories in our voice from Quebec. Another challenge faced by our community is access to health and education services in English. Yes, we do have English hospitals, at least in Montreal and Quebec City, but there is a lack of English language care available in the regions, especially for the elderly members of our community, many of whom are isolated, unilingual, and without the benefit of family and community support structures. English school boards exist providing English language education in Quebec. We know that. But in the regions, our young people do not have the same types of access or opportunities available in specialized fields of study and pursuit, drawing young people away from their homes to pursue other opportunities. We are, in short, a community in need of support to maintain its vitality and sustainability. Like the FCFA in their report of last November, we are also critical of the 1991 Official Languages Regulations that base services on demographic calculations rather than the territorial principle. Canada's linguistic minority communities are in demographic decline. Rural and isolated communities are especially vulnerable. Framing Section 4 in isolation, as the FCFA's report aptly points out, negates the main two purposes of the Act. One, communicating with or providing services to the public and in carrying out the work of federal institutions, and two, in supporting the development of English and French linguistic minority communities. We are also fully endorse the FCFA's 3 Cs approach to ensure that the intentions of the Official Languages Act is realized. The Act must be understood and applied in a way that is coherent, constituent, and continuous. We would particularly like to establish the need to align the provision of English services with provincial frameworks. The official language minority community should always have the benefit of the most generous program. For the English-speaking community of Quebec, our influence and inclusion in official languages processes is improving, but it is still far from equal with the Francophone minority outside Quebec. We were appalled and extremely disappointed, for example, in the recent speech from the throne, which failed to include the English-speaking community of Quebec in referencing the roadmap for Canada's linguistic duality. The roadmap, of course, represents the core strategy which outlines the Government of Canada's major policy decisions regarding linguistic duality and the development of official language minority communities. So the questions that come to mind are, how is this omission going to be understood by the bureaucrats managing the current roadmap and those beginning to design the replacement in 2013? Who decides to understand duality meaning one? Last week, I wrote a letter to the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages on this very question, and we are waiting an answer. Finally, we also endorsed the FCFS call for increasing the powers of the Commissioner of Official Languages. It is clear to the QCGN that the English-speaking community of Quebec is best served by an empowered, apolitical guardian of linguistic rights. It is a matter of record that on matters of education, employment and immigration, the Government of Canada has negotiated bilateral agreements with the province of Quebec, this without substantive consultation with the English-speaking community of Quebec, and without any mechanisms to account for how federal funding supports our community's vitality. In practical terms, the Government of Canada's responsibilities under Section 7 of the Official Languages Act towards our community are scrubbed when federal powers are devolved or funding provided to Quebec. An empowered Commissioner of Official Languages could play an important role in this process, especially if he or she ensured the Government of Canada met its obligation towards the English community of Quebec in the government's bilateral dealings with Quebec. In conclusion, we strongly support the Francophones in Quebec and in Canada, and we understand the reasonable measures necessary to support and strengthen the French language. Our community is certainly not concerned with the health and vitality of the English language, which we expect will continue to do quite well on its own. But the English-speaking community of Quebec is indeed concerned about its vitality and long-term sustainability and identity. The community's goal is integration, the attainment of French language skills for its youth, and the inclusion of the community in all aspects of Quebec society. A strong, integrated, bilingual, and engaged English-speaking community in Quebec is the very model of Canadian linguistic duality. With the permission of the Chair, I would now like to introduce Nicola Johnston, as you already know, is co-chair of our Youth Standing Committee. Ms. Johnston is a second-year graduate student at Carleton University, completing an MA in Public Policy and Administration. Thank you, Mr. Blaney.
Please go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donnelly, for that introduction. Bonjour, Monsieur Blaney, Mesdames et Messieurs. Gentlemen, I feel very honored to be able to speak to you today as a young English speaker from Quebec, so thank you very much for this opportunity to testify in front of the committee today. As Mr. Donnelly said, I am an English-speaking youth from the Eastern Townships. I believe that as English-speaking youth have a unique identity. We're unique because we live in a dynamic place where we have the opportunity to become bilingual and where we are surrounded by people who are both French or English or both. Because of this, we often feel that when we leave Quebec, there is something missing. We value the bilingual and bicultural home from which we came, and many of us want to stay or come home. Like many young Quebecers, my hope is to remain a fully engaged member of the province and of my home region, contributing to its future in every way my talents will allow. To do so, myself and many other Quebecers have worked hard to achieve bilingual skills. 80% of English mother tongue Quebecers between 15 and 45 are bilingual. In return, we expect acceptance and the space in which to preserve our English identity, and the opportunity for greater integration into the Quebec society as bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural Quebecers. But the reality is that the English-speaking youth in Quebec face lower political participation and representation and higher unemployment rates compared to their Francophone counterparts. We are effectively barred from the Quebec civil service with a participation rate of 0.2%. For example, my master's degree is meant to effectively train me to work in the federal or provincial civil service, but I know that it will be a major challenge and perhaps even an obstacle for me to be able to serve in the public service of my own province, because I am an English speaker, and in contrast, many of my classmates will return to their home provinces to work in the provincial civil service, building on a sense of identity and belonging and ownership that is perhaps not available to me and to others like me. And as well, for many, the hope of economic well-being and belonging lies elsewhere, beyond the regions in which we grew up. Ironically, our bilingualism is an asset to employers beyond Quebec, and at the same time, being an English speaker puts us at an economic disadvantage at home. For a person like me who will graduate with 2 degrees, the statistical likelihood of residing in the province is low. Statistics show that the higher the education level attained, the lower the probability that graduates will stay in or return to Quebec. This further fuels population decline in rural communities, including the eastern townships where I am from, where there is a considerable missing middle. But on a positive note, today's youth clearly express their desire to stay in Quebec and to contribute to Quebec society. They wish to move away from past conflicts and insecurities as they embrace bilingualism, social cohesion, and an authentic desire to put an end to the 2 solitudes. We know that the rate of outmigration is slowing. The bilingual, highly educated cohort has made the effort to gain the linguistic skills needed to fully participate in Quebec society, by seeking and receiving better French language instruction and by linking to our French society. The youth of the English-speaking community of Quebec are a tremendous resource, capable not only of translating the English-speaking world, but acting as organic linguistic brokers, able to bridge cultural as well as linguistic barriers. So today we urge the Government of Canada to fulfill its obligations towards the English-speaking youth in Quebec, to engage us in a formal, meaningful, and sustained way to ensure our success, to lead the process of demonstrating that we are a valuable and a recognized asset to Quebec and to Canada. We want to stay in Quebec, but often our chances of staying are stacked against us. But we are more than willing and more than able citizens of Quebec. So I urge you today, for the sake of tomorrow, to help us to live in our own province, to allow us to enjoy our unique background as well as our unique contemporary bicultural context. Allow us to both enjoy and contribute to this quality of life and to this opportunity. Donc, merci de nouveau pour cette chance de vous.
So once again, thank you for this opportunity to address this committee today. I strongly hope that my experience and suggestions will be of hope to you today. Thank you.
Ms. Johnston and Mr. Donnelly for those testimony, and I would like to remind the member, if they want, the full speech has been provided to you in a written part. Alors, on va commencer sans plus tarder le premier tour avec.
Without further ado, we'll start our first turn with Mr. Bélanger. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Martin-Laforge.
These rather thoughtful comments, which I believe deserve a lot of reflection and serious thought. Now, I wanted to see if I could test with you my understanding of the situation that the Anglophone community in Quebec is currently living. And someone put to me recently a phrase that I thought captured it quite well, and I'd like your reaction to this. That individual said essentially that in Quebec, the English language is not threatened, but the Anglophone community is. And that sentence enabled me, I think, to understand what the Anglophone community of Quebec is going through, because it allowed me to relate to it as a Francophone from Ontario, in that I've become bilingual because I wanted to participate fully in my province's affairs. I had difficulty getting services. As a youth, I had to get on picket lines to get my schools so I could go to school in French. Getting health services was near impossible in my own language. It was only made possible thanks to the nuns, really, essentially, and on and on and on. So if one tried to describe the situation of the Anglophone community and through QCGN's leadership in that sentence, that in Quebec the English language is not threatened, but the Anglophone community is, how would you react to that?
I'll just say something quickly, and then maybe Sylvia will also comment. I think, Mr. Belanger, it's a question of what we keep saying, community vitality is the big issue. And yes, in terms of language, as I said in my speech, we live in the reality of North America. Everybody with cable TV and satellite has 200 and 300 English TV stations, so there's no lack in terms of language. But in terms of community vitality, especially in the regions, now that's not to say that there are not problems in Montreal as well, there are, but especially in the regions, in terms of institutions and communities, if school populations are dwindling, then services are dwindling. Schools are so important in terms of the cultural aspect. They become cultural centers of the communities. And when the school numbers are dwindling, that is dwindling. When youth leave because they have to go away to study, and then the problem is so many now don't come back to their hometowns, and that affects, that's what we talk about in terms of out-migration. In the last census, it seems to have equalized now, new people coming into Quebec versus those leaving, but in terms of youth, it's double factor. So yes, it's not a question of language, but it is a question of community vitality. Sylvia, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Well, I think that from the perspective of youth, and other questions will probably allow Nicola to talk to you a bit more about it, the renewal of the English-speaking community is a huge challenge. Because we are not a host society anymore for the attraction of new immigrants, which we understand, that puts enormous pressure on the demography, coupled with very important numbers of young people who don't find a place in Quebec, even though they are fully bilingual. They leave. So it's not about language. It's about a demographic renewal. It's all throughout the province, from the townships to the Gaspé, from the Magdalen Islands to Asbestos region. And so we've lost communities. We've lost in Jonquière, Alma. The volunteers just got tired, and they just closed up because they just don't see that they can make a difference in terms of momentum, in terms of the community. So demographic decline is huge.
Second. You still have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. To go. Sorry, there's not enough, but I will read to you, and I only have the French version. I'm sorry about that. A paragraph in the speech from the throne, which you alluded to in your remarks, Mr. Donnelly. Notre pays est bilingue, les deux langues.
Our country is bilingual. We have two official languages. That's an integral part of our history, and it gives us quite a unique advantage. And he continues to the last sentence, which was particularly striking for me, and it's the only paragraph in which there's a reference to linguistic duality. So it says that the Government of Canada will continue as well to respect provincial jurisdictions and to restrict the use of the federal authority to spend.
Martin Laforge is nodding, but I'd like a reaction to that.
Answer for your next turn, if you wish. On va maintenant aller avec Monsieur Nadeau.
We'll now move on to Mr. Nadeau. Good morning. Good morning to all of you, to Ms. Martin Laforge, Ms. Johnston, and Mr. Donnelly. I did not put my earpiece on because I wasn't listening to you. It's because my friend Mauril speaks a little more loudly than Ms. Johnston. But I heard perfectly well on this side, not on the other, though. So I just put it on so I could hear you better. Ms. Johnston, you mentioned education earlier, and you mentioned that this is an important issue for your community, because I think you've raised an area that's particularly interesting. Thank you for the question.
The importance, there have been a lot of dwindling enrollment numbers in English schools, primary and secondary. And that is a main issue for, I really truly believe that English schools are centers of community vitality for our communities. And when those enrollments dwindle, those schools can potentially close down. And those are threats, they're not just centers of learning, but they're places where there are extracurricular activities for kids. They are places where parents and kids forge lasting friendships. And that's not just friendships, but it's also social capital. I continue to draw on the relationships that I have with people from my English schools, where I went, and I think that that's tremendously important. But schools are also centers of economic activity. They're very important places of employment for our communities. I have many friends of mine who are teachers in English schools, and I don't know what they would do otherwise. They would have to leave if those schools closed down. So I think that that's one important aspect to consider. And the other important aspect, I think, is that we really need greater integration into French society. And when I mean greater integration, I'm not just talking about better, more advanced French language skills, because I think there is already that attempt, but I'm also talking about bridging some divides. So I'm talking about biculturalism as well. And I'll give you an example. I went to a regional high school, and there was a French side and an English side. And it was called the French, we referred to it as the French side and the English side because there were no attempts to harmonize activities between the schools. And this was a very clear division that happened on the playground. And I really think that this is a testament to what we have referred to as the two solitudes that happen. And I really think that there needs to be a concerted effort to harmonize that. And I mean, these two sides are administered by a French and an English school board. But I don't think that that should be a barrier to sort of creating a further integration. I really think that, that as Sylvia was saying, language is not the main issue, but it's also the biculturalism and having Anglophones allowing Anglophones and Francophones to feel like we get each other in so many words.
D'accord. Tantôt, Monsieur Bélanger posait.
Earlier, Mr. Bélanger put a question to you, and I think I'd like to follow up on that one and give you an opportunity to answer his question, Ms. Sylvia. Well, the question was on transfer of federal powers to province. In Quebec, this certainly happened with two programs. There was immigration and training.
Immigration, because it's a complicated piece of work for a 2-minute answer. But in terms of employment, let me tell you the impact of employment. Right now, in the Eastern Townships, there is not available to English-speaking, even though they're bilingual, when you're looking for a job or you're looking for something important in your life, you know, whether it be access to health care or employment, and you want to talk to somebody who has the same understanding of you, same background as you, there's not enough capacity in the Eastern Townships to refer people to jobs, because there has been a devolution. And so the devolution to Emploi Québec has meant that there is a lack of service for employment services across the province in English. And so we have a high unemployment rate, very, very well connected to the fact that we can't get service in English. One of our members, Youth Employment Services in Montreal, has a provincial mandate but can only work in Montreal. And the numbers of people who go there because they can't go to the other employment centers, provincial employment centers, because they don't feel they get adequate service in English is amazing. So that's a huge example of how when you devolve and you aren't making sure that the community will be well served as a result of the devolution, you're affecting the vitality very strongly.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Nadeau. On va continuer.
Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. Let's move on to Mr. Godin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it sounds like where I come from, except it's the opposite.
So, question is not the language, but it's the community, right? It's how you develop the community, how you bring people in, and how you get people to have jobs. Well, they had the way to fix it down home. Le blanc become the white. Les rois deviennent les rois. Les Monsieur Lebrun est devenu des Brown to get a job. I mean, that's the reality of what happens home. It's unbelievable. And you know that. I'm sure you know how it happens now. The only question or observation I have when you and by the way, don't take me wrong, that's not what I want you to do. I think it was terrible. You know, what happens now home, people have to change names to have a job. Don't take me wrong. Okay? Even if they call me Godin instead of Godin, don't take me wrong. God, yeah. God. But an observation about when you said, you know, I see to school and seems to be they don't want the student to get together and it's wrong and we should integrate. But the fact is, when that happens, I think it happens down home when they had to have the two districts separated, the Anglophone district of the school and the French. Because when they get in the yard, they were not speaking like learning both language. Everybody was just speaking English, and we were losing our French then. And the fact is that the Supreme Court of Canada, right now, I'm asking the Supreme Court, I have a bill in the House asking the Supreme Court to be, when they have an appointment, to the person to be bilingual. Not French, not English, be bilingual. And the government is voting against it. Because the fact is, and this is the fact, when the case is done in French, when the case is heard in French, and the 9 judges get together to talk about the case after that, because one person does not speak French in the 9 judges, the whole conversation is in English. And that's the facts, you know. And then I think that's where people are, I just want to give you that as me, how I feel about it. People are scared of it. That's what will happen. And they had to do that. I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's... And I heard some Anglophones saying to us sometimes, say, we cannot learn French because you don't give us a chance to learn French, because every time we go to speak, you switch to English and we don't have a chance to practice. That's another fact. I just wanted to put that in front of you. But when you're saying it's not the language, on the other hand, it's the language too, because you're saying we cannot get a job even if we are bilingual. I want to understand that, because to me it doesn't make sense. I mean, if a person could hire somebody that is bilingual, he get better service, he could give better service to the population. I think he could give better service. I'm not saying that's what they are doing, but I'm saying if they hired somebody that is bilingual and somebody called, then you could give a better service to the population if you're bilingual. Then why do you think it's going that way?
I would like to refer you to an article that has come up in Metropolis. Metropolis is a conference that happened on the weekend, and there's a document in there that is called Linguicism and I don't remember the rest of the... Richard Bourgis, a noted researcher who does a lot of international work and work with the English-speaking community, and some of the reasons why an Anglophone in Quebec would not get a job. Now, we don't want to talk about racism very out loud, but I mean, it's not about racism, but it is about linguicism. It is the fact that the French is never quite good enough. It'll never be good enough to get a job in Quebec. We understand, and we all live, I think you all heard us speak French, la langue du Québec, c'est le français.
But Quebec's language is French, and service is provided in French in Quebec. And if you have a slight accent, an English accent in French, when you speak French, then you rarely, very rarely, perhaps it happens 0.02% of the time, you'll very rarely be given the opportunity or a job. You'll get a job, but you won't necessarily get a higher position in that language. Well, it's like here in Ottawa. Just to take an example, there are deputy ministers in departments who don't speak French at all. But there isn't one single deputy minister at the federal level in Canada that speaks French and who isn't able to speak English. Thank you, Mr. Godin. So that's what I'm saying. I understand your situation. Thank you. We'll continue with Ms. Glover. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all our witnesses. It gives me great pleasure to meet you today. Ms. Johnston, it's truly a pleasure to see young people here from Quebec, where you can speak in English or in French. Obviously, that's a choice. And I hope that we'll be seeing you here again, because I think that young people have a significant amount to contribute.
Something that Mr. Godin said about the Supreme Court. I believe there was a little bit of misinformation there, because when there is English spoken in the court, the conversation just doesn't go straight to English. Anyone who wants to speak French in the Supreme Court, they have the abilities to speak whatever language they want, and there is simultaneous translation. Now, I think that's very important in the Supreme Court of Canada, because as far as I am concerned, even though we are bilingual, there are times where we don't.
Excusez-moi, Madame la Présidente. Est-ce que vous voulez...
Point of order. I'd just like to correct the record. I never said that you couldn't speak the language of your choice in the Supreme Court. I said when the judges are meeting afterwards, they speak together in their language. So I'm just setting the record straight. That's not a point of order, Mr. Godin. Well, let's go back to where we were with Ms. Glover.
I believe it's very important that as bilingual people who were born Anglophones, who try our very best to learn the French language, that we remember that we live in a Canada where competencies and education also mean something. And in the Supreme Court of Canada, it's not about language. It's about giving the best legal representation that an accused person or a victim deserve. And in saying that, I am bilingual, vous êtes bilingue aussi, mais il y a des temps.
We're also bilingual, but there are times when we don't completely understand because of an accent, let's say, or because of the language from the area we come from. So we don't always absolutely understand the meaning of perhaps one word or an idea.
Eliminate simultaneous translation in the Supreme Court of Canada, that we not deprive accused people and English-speaking people of the ability to have the best representation. So I just wanted to correct that, and I know I've used up much of my time. I hope Monsieur Godin's inaccurate point of order didn't take away from my time. I'm interested in knowing, because I lived what you want to live, Mademoiselle Johnson. I lived in I went to a school where it was a Francophone base, and they allowed the English-speaking people in my community to come to that school. And we thrived. Our French is considered some of the best French in our province. And later on, we did as you've described, we separated them. And I've noticed that the French that's being spoken in my home province is not the same as what I learned. And so I worry about that. So I'm curious to know, how do you live in French when you are separated like that? How do you live in French outside of your school? Because without theaters, without those things, what do you have available to you so that you can live in French outside of your school?
Do you mean what opportunities are there available to practice?
Cultural opportunities like theaters, etc. Do you have access to all of those things to allow you as English-speaking people, without being pushed aside, because I know that happens often even in my own province, where if you aren't born Francophone, sometimes there's a tendency to push aside. Do you have that problem, or do you have complete access to attend theaters, etc., without being pushed aside, so that you can live in French?
You mean in French? Access to these services in French?
In French, because I heard a little bit of this linguicism, right? And I know exactly what you mean, because there are times when in my community too, if you weren't born Francophone, you know, you're pushed aside. I want to know, are you accepted when you go to the French theaters? Do you feel this tension that exists like in your school?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. I would say that that Anglophone people we try the best that we can to be able to participate in those kind of services that are available. But we certainly, I mean, for instance, the hometown that I come from, we have to go a little further afield to access those. I would say that they're not readily accessible in the area that I came from. I don't know. Do you want to take that one on, Sylvia?
I could.
I'm not.
Yeah, and in terms of it's not a. When we said in our speech, it's not a question of language, right? Language is a factor, obviously. It's always going to be a factor. But feeling at home in your community is not going to be measured for us in terms of community vitality in our English communities across Quebec on how much integration there is in the Francophone sector. When it comes to arts and culture, we all go to English movies, French movies, we go see French singers, English singers, that's just natural, in Montreal and the rest of Quebec. But in terms of when you're talking about even the school situations, right? In terms of community vitality, an English school with a very strong Francophone population of kids who are going there to become Francophones who want to improve their English. But they're not looking to integrate into the English community. And when it comes down to after that, when they go for the jobs, the reality is a Francophone has gotten into an English school and reached a middle level of bilingualism with the English is always going to get the job rather than the Anglophone who's reached a middle level with French, because that's still the majority language of work and so forth. So that's one of the challenges that we face, and that's why our youth for the last year have been telling us, and this is something that's a problem not only in the rurals, but in Montreal as well. We need to improve the teaching of French in the English schools for the English students. Okay. The good thing is we get a good population of Francophones in the schools, so there's already a Francophone environment a little bit. There's a lot of bilingualism going on. But in terms of raising to a higher level of bilingualism, meaning in our case French for the English students, will help them get jobs where they live and increase the chances of their staying there.
And being accepted is a part of that.
Thank you, Ms. Glover. Ms. Johnston was speaking of the importance of school in the community, not only for academic. A good example is this first St. Patrick Parade in Quebec City for the last 60 years. It started into the St. Patrick's School in Quebec City. So we'll now enter into our second and last round of this first part of the meeting, and I would like Ms. Zarak to get us started.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to go back to Ms. Johnson. You said about jobs in public service, whereas the English represent 8.2% of the population, and yet there's only 0.8% in public services, and most of those people are, of course, bilingual. At the committee here, we had some people from the public service, and they said that bilingualism isn't a criteria for hiring people. I would like to have your comment about that. Shouldn't that be a basic criteria for a job?
Can you just repeat the last segment of that question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
We had the public service here at the committee, and they said that when they're hiring people, they don't, it's not always a criteria to be bilingual. Should that be in Canada, where we have two languages? What do you think about not being a criteria for a job?
I think that it's essential to be able to perform bilingually in the federal public service. But I certainly think that as an Anglophone going in with a bilingual background, that you are a much larger asset. For instance, I did a co-op placement with the Federal Public Service last summer, and I was hired, I'm fairly certain, a large part, one part of the assets, because I have a bilingual background that my sort of English-speaking cohorts at Carleton University don't have. So I think that's in the federal public service. But in the provincial public service, my understanding is that it'll be much more difficult for me, even though I do have some level of bilingualism, but it certainly is not adequate enough to get me and be able to have a job in the provincial public service. And to me, that's unfortunate, because it is something I do want to return home. I do want to live in Quebec. I do want to participate, and I certainly hope that it won't be the case and that I will be able to. But it's certainly an impediment.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Donnelly, you said that you were kind of disappointed that there was no, in the throne speech, that there was no mention for what would be done to Anglophones. And this government brags about consulting Canadians. And I'm quite surprised that when you mentioned that with the provinces, that the federal government and the provincial, when they met to discuss, you were not part of that discussion, and yet you represent 32 associations. So I'd like to give you the opportunity, or what would be your recommendations if they did consult with you?
In terms of the roadmap?
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously, if you're not at the table, you're not in a serious part of the discussions. And when the non-mention, if I can use that term, in the throne speech of us officially as being one of the two official minority languages communities, and I'm not afraid to say that I'm naive enough to even, when I found out about that, ask my DG, well, maybe it's just a slip. Maybe it's just, you know, they're so used to saying Francophone communities, maybe for once. And she tells me very clearly that nothing in the throne speech is a slip. Everything is there for a reason. So when we see this strong mention of the support for Francophone minorities outside Quebec and how that's going to be a priority, and no mention whatsoever of us, and then we think, as the discussions continue, I mentioned a little bit in my ELAN, our English Language Arts Network. We, after the QCGN, over the space of the last 12 months, has invested over $60,000 of manpower and money in developing a cultural, arts, culture, and heritage proposal for using of the roadmap funding. And for a year, we've been getting signals that, well, it's not quite this, you have to change that, we're thinking about it, and for a whole year. And now when you see something like this and you say, well, if they don't even think, not even sure that we really exist in the throne speech, well, what kind of signal does that send to a ministry which is administering that money and deciding how it's and where it's going to be spent? It becomes very frustrating.
So,
Thank you. Ms. Zarak will now continue with Mr. Nadeau. Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a phenomenon that exists, and it's not just in Quebec and it's not just in Canada. We see this everywhere. This is this idea of youth who leave to go to major metropolitan centers to study for their studies. So, for example, you see it, for example, comparing urban and rural areas. People leave the rural centers to live, to study in these major metropolitan areas. Some of them don't come back. Some of them never return to their small towns, and some of them do. What would you say as an incentive if we were to encourage, and not just a question of English speaking or French speaking, but this whole issue of ensuring the vitality of communities? And this is a bit what I'm hearing from you, something that really concerns you. It actually goes beyond just the linguistic question. It's an issue of identity. So if for young people who went to study at university, who finished their studies, if there was some incentive, such as a tax credit for youth, to return to their home communities, to where they come from, would this be a solution that would be doable? Or do you have any other thoughts with respect to this? Answer?
I believe that incentives like that are very important, actually, and I think I would just say that, yes, those are the kind of incentives that would be needed to bring people back to their communities.
D'accord. Parce qu'on a déposé un projet de loi là à cet égard.
Thank you. We tabled a bill to this effect, and this bill is running its course, but this would be, in fact, to give a choice to young people, a choice to return. Shutting down the regions is not a region, and unfortunately people hear the opposite. There are no incentives, and in terms of, as a society, I think we have some work to do. Mr. Nadeau, could I please interrupt? I'd like to tell the committee that there is a very good program in Quebec which is called Place aux Jeunes, a place for youth. It's a provincial program which encourages young people to return to their home communities. And incidentally, in the townships, the DG there, Rachel Garber, managed to get this program. But the structure of the program, it's a provincial program. So in terms of Anglophones, there's some problems because of representation, because of the number of youth, and so forth. So when you come up with these programs at the federal level, and keep in mind that this is provincial jurisdiction, it causes problems for us because we don't, the community can't work with the program, inside the program, which is devolved to the provinces. So you need to understand that the province of Quebec grants rights to English speakers, but the rights that English speakers have are individual rights. So when you devolve any program to the province, yes, you're giving certain programs, and Quebecers will say, yes, we respect Anglophones, but
the vitality of the community. So I would ask, you to consider that very, very significantly. We're talking about services, we're talking about services to individuals, we're not talking about the vitality of the community because it doesn't fit in a provincial framework of Quebec. So the federal government, federal powers can do lots of different things, but if it is not understood that in Quebec it is not taken in the same spirit around community, you're throwing good money after bad for the English-speaking community.
Excellent. Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nadeau, now we'll move back to Ms. Glover. Thank you again.
I want to finish off what we were talking about before because I think this discussion about the minority Anglophone community or English-speaking community in Quebec is very important because our government absolutely supports the need to support that community. And it's been said many, many times by not only the Minister of Official Languages, but by myself and many of the members, that this is a necessity, that we must support the English-speaking minority community in Quebec, as we do the Francophone-speaking minority communities in other places. But I want to ask you very clearly, what do you think of the bill and the judges that demands that all Supreme Court judges be completely and fluently bilingual to the point where simultaneous translation is not provided?
We have a step. Yeah, when the bill was first announced, we took the issue to our board and supported in principle that approach, except there has to be an implementation phase, and there's different ways of doing that. You can get a judge who comes in with 50% bilingual. It can be brought up within the period of 6 months, or you can make it a binding factor even before the judge is named. So that's what's not really clear, but the principle is something we supported.
Mm-hmm. And we have said as a government, the principle is a good principle. That the problem is we don't have the ability to hire judges at that rate across the entire country. It would put several provinces in a position where they do not have a large enough pool. And Madame Laforge, I'm going to use you as an example. Madame Laforge was speaking earlier and couldn't remember a word in French. Without this simultaneous translation, judges will miss because of accent, because of capacity to understand different languages, and that is our fear. And we do not want to prejudice those who have the huge competencies in law that we need in a Supreme Court to not be considered because, again, competency should mean something. There are a number of other bills, of course, that focus on some of these things. I'm sure that you will be consulted at some point or another on many of them, and I welcome your input at any time. My office is always open. We've had a very good working relationship, and I look forward to your input on many of those things. I, again, am very interested in your community. Mademoiselle Johnson, being a youth who's afraid you won't be able to work in your community is disturbing, because you are what my community considers to be what we strive for. You are a very, very high-level bilingual person, and it's bothersome to hear that you don't think you can get a job there. We did a study, 5,000 jobs every year in the public service for bilinguals cannot be filled. And your community could help us fill those positions, but to hear that you don't think you'll be able to fill them because in your province you're never quite French enough. How do we fix that? I don't think a tax credit to help you finish your school is going to address that sentiment that was expressed by Madame Laforge and yourself, that you're never French enough. Do you honestly think that a tax credit is going to change the thinking amongst the people who are hiring, as you've expressed, that don't choose English-speaking people first as a rule because they're not quite French enough? Your words?
It's not the answer, but it's part of the puzzle. And incentives, there could be financial incentives for students to help come back. We have seen in Gaspé region some very interesting proactive measures involving getting community students to come back. When I said in my speech, I used the term out-migration, as they're already saying. When students move from Gaspé and les Îles-Madeleine and Baie-Comeau to Montreal to study, because they can't get the programs in English where they live, those are important people for coming back. And now communities are finding proactive and interesting measures to try to encourage that happening, getting them back. That involves, and the second thing is in terms of the language, I'll say it again, our youth is for the last 2 years, it's one of the big things they've been telling us time and time again. We need to improve the level of French being taught to English students in English schools, and that will help.
Thank you, Ms. Glover. And we'll now conclude the second round with Mr. Godin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Juste vite sur maintenant.
Thank you. It's now Ms. Glover, and it's not a point of order, said it took away from her minutes when I raised a point of order. So, second, the testimony, what Ms. Glover is saying, that the bill will remove interpretation from the Supreme Court. This was never the intention. This is not found in the bill. These are, this is not the truth. She is trying to fearmonger among Canadians, and this is regrettable because her government doesn't want to support this. They don't recognize bilingualism in Canada. They don't recognize that language services must be provided in both languages. Mr. Donnelly, I appreciate that you say that you report it in principle, but I think that this is a lack of respect towards the community, as if judges or lawyers weren't smart enough to learn French. It's embarrassing to the English community. It's unacceptable. But we'll put this issue aside. The speech from the throne, Mr. Donnelly, you said that it was regrettable that there was no mention of the English language minority community in this speech from the throne. Beyond that, beyond the speech from the throne, we're looking at the budget. We're not only Anglophones, but there's nothing in the budget for anyone. Anglophones or Francophones. A speech from the throne with no vision doesn't go very far. Would you agree with me? Yes, but at least your community is represented in the speech from the throne. Well, it's all fine and dandy to have nice promises, but in action. Fine words. For example, the Olympic Games will be bilingual and so forth. Well, let's understand that the games were not bilingual. There were programs. The opening ceremonies, there was not a lot of bilingualism. But a budget for implementation is still important. Okay, back to another question important for you. When we talk about grants and contributions, you'll recall that programs and monies, you make requests in the month of June. It takes time. There's red tape.
This last year that it will go better, and I'd like to hear you out on that because I think it's important. And we're talking.
We saw your report with the many recommendations from this committee relative to that. We are still in the process now but things, yes, did seemingly improve in the months after we made the presentation here and in the months during the time this committee made its report. The minister in his comments has promised that this is something that will be very, very much improved in terms of next year's funding when we're talking about advanced funding. Normally that comes through in the month of early April. So sorry.
I can tell you, my president was in Florida when there was an important meeting a couple of weeks ago administratively, and I have to congratulate the people who took this to heart and did put together some standards. So I have a lot of faith that something will be happening in April this year rather than June. So I'm sorry, Bob, I didn't want to cut you off, Mr. President, but we were encouraged by the work that, as a result of the committee's work, the minister's work, and the bureaucrats, that we do believe there will be a big difference this year.
Okay, that's mean the committee has done their job by bringing it to the open.
I think everybody has done. I think we think that everybody did their job, taking this seriously, and I have to say that we're hopeful.
When you were talking about the incentive, and they said, well, the incentive is kind of contradiction because if you don't have any job, you will not go. But we know we have the same problem, I think, all across the country when we got people leaving the rural area, going in big city, and then don't want to come back. I mean, you know, it's facts of life. But what you are saying, if I understand right, with an incentive, it brings back the people in the community. It grow the community in your language that you are, your culture, and it grow, and it's not there to disappear if you got your youth coming back if they had. And is that what you are actually saying?
Thank you.
Well, you could say yes or no. Give her that chance.
I think you're right. I think that the issue of out-migration is one that is Canada-wide, but I think that the issue in Quebec is that it's a sort of twofold issue. It's the rural-urban divide, but it's also some of the linguistic barriers that are impediments because there are it's better for us to go. We have an asset as bilingual speakers to go out of the province. So I think that the part of the incentive will help bring people back. And if there is any kind of hesitation, well, we're not sure if we want to go back because we don't know if there will be employment. It's just a good incentive.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. It's just a good incentive, and I think that it'll help minimize any risk that people are afraid of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Godin. So thank you to our witnesses this morning for bringing experience and youth to this committee. Mr. Donnelly, I hope it's just we'll have a chance to see you before you resume your mandate. And I would just like you to remind me my privilege and also my duty to make sure we provide equal voice and equitable consideration to the preoccupation of your committee within this committee. You want to add something?
Thank you, Mr. Blaney. I just wanted to tell you that my mandate as president of the QCGN will end in mid-June with our AGM and new elections. And I wanted to say what a pleasure it has been over the last 3 years to come here. And the last but not least of important, I think if we had, as our community groups in Quebec, across Ottawa, half the support that we've been getting from this committee, we would be a very, very happy organization. So thank you not only for receiving us, but for working with us and helping us reach our goals.
Thank you as well on behalf of the member. Thank you. So we'll just suspend a few minutes to keep on our work. Merci. Les membres.
Perhaps members could take their seats now as quickly as possible. I'm going to continue this morning's hearing. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083F, study of the review, 1083F, study of the official language policies and programs in the main estimates 2010-2011 of the Department of Canadian Heritage. We have the pleasure of hearing from the Honourable James Moore, Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages. He is accompanied by the Deputy Minister, Ms. Larocque. Welcome to the Official Languages Committee, and Mr. Sobrino, Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy, Planning and Corporate Affairs. So with no further delay, Minister, you can make your opening comments. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And members of the committee, it is a pleasure for me to be here today. With me are Judith Larocque, Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage, and Pablo Sobrino, Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy, Planning and Corporate Affairs at Canadian Heritage. I would like to greet the new members of the committee today, Mr. Maurice Bélanger, Mr. Généreux, who will soon be here, and John Weston. And I would also like to thank the committee for inviting me here today to give an update on the official languages file. The timing couldn't be better. We are in the middle of the Rendezvous de la Francophonie, a wonderful opportunity for dialogue and celebration that we are proud to support and that brings together Canadians from every part of the country. Today, I would like to reiterate our government's priorities regarding official languages, present an update on the implementation of the roadmap for Canada's linguistic duality, and discuss our government's ongoing support for community organizations across Canada. But first, allow me to say a few words about the Olympic Winter Games that recently ended and the Paralympic Games that are currently taking place, or rather that just ended. The role of the French language and culture in the context of the Games has been a priority for our government from day one. I'm proud to say the Government of Canada made record levels of investment to ensure that both of our country's official languages were incorporated into all aspects of the Games.
Featuring approximately 650 live performances, over one-third of which were by Francophone artists. The Olympic and Paralympic torch relays, all 15 Olympic venues and every single Olympic site, all fully bilingual, servicing Canadians and visitors in the official language of their choice. The Olympic and Paralympic Games are truly Canada's Games, exceeding the standards of the International Olympic Committee, and more importantly, showcasing the best of what our country has to offer in both official languages. This feeling was echoed by senior officials at the Games. The Commissioner of Official Languages, for instance, said that he was, quote, impressed by the level of bilingualism at the Olympic Games, and, quote, pleased by the presence of French at the closing ceremonies. Monsieur Pascal Couchepin, grand témoin de la francophonie aux Jeux olympiques d'hiver de Vancouver, a affirmé.
Pascal Couchepin, grand témoin de la francophonie at the Games, said, and I quote, "The Vancouver Olympic Games have been very successfully executed. They are the games to follow in the matter of linguistic duality. It is difficult, in my opinion, to do better."
The National Olympic Committee said that he was, quote, very pleased with the success of official languages at the Games. Quote, the announcements were made in French and English, and all Olympic venues and signs were bilingual, he added. Mr. Chair, well over 3 billion people from around the world turned their gaze to Canada during the Olympic Games, and I'm pleased to have been part of such an incredible moment in Canada's history. Les Canadiens qui...
Canadians who didn't have the chance to go to Vancouver and Whistler were able to follow the competitions at home in the official language of their choice, thanks to the broadcasting agreement between CTV Globe Media and its partners. I'm delighted that CTV and CPAC collaborated to present French language coverage of the Games on their stations, as well as RDS and V. The Place de la Francophonie, as well, greeted thousands of visitors and showed the people of Vancouver and the world the quality of our Francophone artists and the vitality of our communities. In addition, the young journalists who took part in Francomedia 2010, a project we supported, offered all Canadians a Francophone perspective of the Games. The community of Maillardville, the cradle of the Francophonie in British Columbia, made great strides in the last year in strengthening its cultural presence. within my home province. Mayerville did us proud, not only during the Games, but also during the celebrations of the town's centenary and the Festival du Bois, an event we are proud to support. I'm proud of this community, which adds extra color to my home province, and of the Games, which inspired enthusiasm in Canadians across the country. Regarding the opening ceremonies, we believe they were a major performance of great quality. David Atkins and his partners from VANOC did an excellent job, and I truly believe that everyone enjoyed them. I was disappointed by the level of French during the ceremonies. However, we are pleased with VANOC's work, and we can all be proud that the Vancouver Olympic Games set a new standard for bilingualism on the international scene. The promotion of our 2 official languages and the support for official language minority communities have been and will continue to be priorities for our government.
Bilingualism is one of the fundamental values of Canadian society. Our roadmap for Canada's linguistic duality allows us to make this vision a reality. Currently, more than 70% of the roadmap commitments announced in June 2008 have been confirmed and funded. Also in the budget, our government maintained our record level of funding for CBC Radio-Canada. This will allow them to continue performing the important work that they do in minority language communities from across the country. Mes homologues des provinces et territoires.
My provincial and territorial counterparts play a key role in achieving our objectives. I will be meeting with them at the upcoming Ministerial Conference on the Canadian Francophonie in Yellowknife on June 22nd and 23rd. These sessions give us a chance to work together to support the Canadian Francophonie. Indeed, it was at the last conference in September 2009 in Vancouver that we agreed to dedicate one day of the Winter Games to the Francophonie. The Language Rights Support Program was also announced last year. As we marked the 40th anniversary of the Official Languages Act, I reiterated our government's commitment to delivering a fully operational program by the end of 2009. I am pleased to say we have delivered. The program, managed by the University of Ottawa, began its activities on December 22nd. Last fall, I also had the honor of chairing the Conference of Ministers responsible for TV5 in Ottawa. In fact, it was during Canada's term as conference chair that we announced an additional contribution of $25 million over 5 years to TV5, starting in 2009-2010. This conference was a complete success, and thanks to this additional funding, TV5 can help increase the visibility of our creative sector and our artists around the world, while reflecting the cultural diversity of La Francophonie.
As you will recall, we also identified a need to revisit our ways of doing things to meet the requirements of organizations that represent official language communities in Canada. Your committee reviewed the impact of delays in approving funding for organizations representing official language minority communities, and we met in October to discuss this issue. Our government will respond to the committee's recommendations by April 1st, but I can tell you that the measures that we are taking are producing results. Currently, we have confirmed program funding for 88% of organizations representing official language minority communities, and we hope to confirm the rest by mid-April. The other recipient organizations should receive a reply in the next few weeks. As well, changes to service standards for the program delivery will be posted on our website on April 1st. Our community partners can rest assured that we are continuing to take action to reduce red tape and streamline the process for their own benefit. In closing, I'd like to share something that made an impression on me during the Olympic Games, the ease with which our athletes and medalists express themselves in both of Canada's official languages. I witnessed this many times, and it made me incredibly proud. Our athletes acted as ambassadors on the world stage, not only athletically, but also diplomatically, and they did so in both of our official languages, representing Canadian culture with great pride. Les athlètes canadiens sont les champions d'aujourd'hui.
Canadian athletes are the champions of today and the leaders of tomorrow, and I can't help feeling that the future of our official languages looks extremely bright. Thank you, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Minister. It looks like you just break one of a record of the swiftness of your opening remarks, so we can get already started with Mr. Damour. Monsieur Damour.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Minister. That's probably the only time you'll get any applause today, so take some pleasure in it. And was it from you? my first question is a comment, actually, 2 brief comments. You stated that official language minority organizations have received confirmation, but remember that it's not only a confirmation that we recommended, we also wanted money to follow. So even if organizations receive confirmation, they do have to get that money. They need to get bridging funds in order to be able to continue their activities. Because if not, once again, they need to use their credit cards. They need to pay interest that you will not reimburse because they don't know when the money will come in order to pay salaries. That's my comment. So it's not enough to receive confirmation. Now, Minister, we'll have to do this quite quickly. We asked for 2 hours with you this morning. We've only been given 1 hour, and we know that there's a bit of a trend lately. That is to say that we get 1 hour to meet the ministers during committee meetings, and I hope in the future this will change. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. You talked about the roadmap. Minister, what is the point of a roadmap if at the end of the road you do not take time to listen to communities and organizations? Now, you'll probably tell me that you've done this, you've done that, you're going to do more. But what I'm saying is, what is the point of a roadmap if at the same time you do not take time to listen to those who have something to say? Last week, there was a meeting with François Côté from L'Arc du Canada. Now, that organization asked to meet with you so that they could put forward a new project for community radio stations. $4.2 million was the amount that was raised. And a colleague of mine asked if those funds were requested. And the answer from the organization was yes. They put the question to the minister a year and a half ago. They said that in November they put in a new request or application because they hadn't been given an answer. And they were told that they would maybe be met with in the future. Minister, do you think that's acceptable? You've raised the roadmap, but what is the point of a roadmap if you don't take the time to meet important organizations like L'Arc du Canada that are there to ensure the survival of community radios throughout the country? So how can you say that the roadmap is moving ahead if you're refusing to meet with an organization as important as that one and that represents so many communities across the country? Well, first, I was appointed Secretary of State in 2008, and the first thing I did when I was appointed is that I held roundtables around the country, and I met not only people who can come here to Ottawa, but I myself traveled to Prince Edward Island, to Nanaimo in British Columbia, to Edmonton, Regina. And so I traveled throughout the country precisely in order to meet with these people who are delivering services in their communities. So we're talking about small organizations, 2 or 3 people, but I went there to see what they were doing and to see what their experience was. Yes, but Minister, community radios are organizations that sometimes don't even have one full-time person. And you're saying you've been doing this since 2008. We're here in 2010. There's a group asking to meet with you, not only for their own purpose here in Ottawa, but to better serve community radios throughout the country. Now, I have 3 of those in my own riding, and I could get a number out for you that represents how many radio stations there are throughout the country. So I'm not talking about this huge organization. I'm talking about an organization that represents small community radios and that often don't even have one full-time employee. Now, a year and a half ago, a request was made to meet with you to put forward their project. They didn't get that meeting, and they've only now just been given confirmation of a receipt of their request. Well, I've met with many, many people. Now, you can take a look at my schedule if you want to. It's on my website. And third, if it's something that's that important to you and to your riding, why is this the first time you're raising it? Because, Minister, we learned of this last Tuesday. Last Tuesday, we learned of the letter that was sent to you a year and a half ago. But if that's what it takes, we'll meet with you personally and we'll see if things move faster. Well, obviously, that organization is so important that you could never bother to raise it with me before. Now, Mr. Chairman, I was available for 2 hours, but it was the decision of this committee that I was asked to come this week instead for 1 hour, but I was available last week for 2 weeks. It was your choice to put off the meeting with me until this week. Thank you, Minister. In fact, that is true. And we'll now move on to Mr. Nadeau. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Minister, and Ms. Larocque and Mr. Sobrino. Good morning to you all. The meeting was cancelled for a technical reason. We've always asked for televised meetings, and that was the issue. It wasn't because we didn't want to meet with you. It was purely for a technical reason. Now, that being said, Minister, there are 3 issues that I would like to raise, and I'll start with the first. This is something I'm sure you've already heard about. You said in self that you were rather disappointed at the opening ceremonies for the Olympic Games. We realized recently that the government had not required equal representation of both languages in the opening ceremonies. So by not requiring it, we ended up with the situation that occurred, an unfortunate one, where there was not equal representation for the Francophone communities in the opening ceremonies. And Mr. Charest also stated that that was unfortunate. That about 40 complaints have been laid with the Official Languages Commissioner about the opening ceremonies that did not equally represent English and French at the time. In fact, French was almost completely absent from the opening ceremonies. We met with you before the Games. We heard you in the House of Commons. We met with Vanok. And Vanok said, don't worry, be happy. But then we realized that the opposite happened. Now, were you just being naive at the time? Did you think that all would be well when all wasn't? Or were you not being forthright? And why was there not a clause requiring equal representation of both those languages? And what was the follow-up, or what is the follow-up that you'll be doing? And how do you explain the situation where French was not equally represented? And I'm referring specifically to the opening ceremonies.
I believe that the lesson we need to learn from the Olympic Games, the real lesson for us as a country, is that bilingualism standards internationally are not the same as the standards that exist here in Canada. I think that Vanok made a very good effort with the Games, whether you're talking about sporting events, the buildings, translation services, signage. Everything was perfectly bilingual. And in terms of bilingualism at the Games, I think they were a full and complete success. With the opening ceremonies, I said that, yes, I was disappointed. We were disappointed with the opening ceremonies. One of the things that happened is that Vanok
clear for the entirety of the Games and the entirety of the effort. But I think that what Canada needs to recognize going forward is that the Canadian standard for official languages is not necessarily the same as the IOC standard for official languages, for example, and that we need to continue to assert that and to make sure that that's an expectation that's understood not only by organizations like VANOC, but also all of our partners, private sector and public sector and different levels of government. That's what we need to do. Et alors, les réussites étaient claires, c'était un succès.
But the Games were clearly a success, but there were examples, such as the opening ceremonies, where this message wasn't fully realized. Well, I'm happy to hear you say that, because you are recognizing now that there was a problem, which you explained. It's unfortunate, and it's certainly not a good reflection of the French fact in Canada. On another issue, Mr. Minister. Last week we met with media organizations from minority francophone situations, in other words, press and radio media representatives, and I learned, and I live in the French minority situation, I understand it, but the whole issue of interdepartmental, that still in 2010, still today, organizations, and it's the same thing for English-speaking Quebecers. Thank you. The organizations are being told by the federal government, I just want to raise this and we can come back to it later, but if you want support from Canadian Heritage, don't see the other departments. But I'll come back to this later, Mr. Minister. Thank you. You can reserve your question for the next round. We'll continue now with Mr. Godin. Mr. Godin, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Minister. First, I'd like you to hear that I'd like to thank you for being here this morning. Sincerely, what happened last week is that normally when we meet with the minister, it's public before cameras. Because of this, you offered us 1 hour today. I think you knew full well that if we asked you to come back again, that we would find a different time for you to do this, if we needed to. Yes, that's if my schedule permits, yes. Mr. Godin. On the Olympic issue, I don't want to speak about the Olympics all day long, but everyone's been clear. We didn't complain about, for example, signage. Nobody's complained about bilingualism at the Games per se. It was about the opening ceremonies. Even the Official Languages Commissioner, Mr. Fraser, said he was impressed by the bilingualism, level of bilingualism at the game, and happy at the presence of the French representation at the closing ceremonies and not the opening ceremonies. So you've said that Mr. Fraser, the Official Languages Commissioner, congratulated you or congratulated the Games. But I think everyone agrees that they missed the boat on the opening ceremonies. This wasn't just about representing the Quebec nation. This was about representing francophones within Canada. We could have done better. And it's not to say that VANOC didn't know better, because since the beginning, they have been saying that the games that would be taking place in Vancouver, you know that VANOC appeared several times. We had the Official Languages Commissioner appear as well. So everyone knew about the importance of this issue, but I think that really, for example, there were games in Bathurst. There were games, sporting games in Bathurst in 2003, and people complained about the lack of French at the opening ceremony. So the closing ceremonies, the situation was improved. So I find it unfortunate that the French community has to fight to have itself represented at events of this type. Mr. Minister. Yes, as I said, I feel that in terms of official languages, I agree with you that with our investments in the Cultural Olympiad, there were, for example, Acadian artists who were present at the Place de la Francophonie. We invested $7 million in this, and also for the Atlantic region. I think it was a real success. Mr. Godin, absolutely I agree with you. But at the opening ceremonies, when you open the games, there was not enough French there. I look at your brief, and you said it yourself. I said I was sorry that there wasn't enough French at the opening ceremony. So you said it. Yes, I was sorry. But we need to get a little perspective, step back and look at everything we saw. This was the largest international event in the history of Canada. We were hosting it. This is why it's important, says Mr. Godin. Yes, I agree, Mr. Moore says. It was very complicated. This was taking place in a province where only 1.3% of the population was Francophone. And with everything we did with the volunteers, the events, the artists, the athletes, our teams, it was a big success. These games were a big success. Yes, Mr. Godin, but I don't accept to say that this, just because it was in Vancouver, artists and athletes travel across this country, and so we can't just skip over it and say it's over with. They opened it. They missed the boat on the opening, and I said I was sorry, says Mr. Moore. Now, on the whole issue of the throne speech from the throne, rather, it refers to official languages. This morning we heard from the English language community in Quebec, and they said that they too were sorry that the federal government didn't even mention them in the speech from the throne. What is happening that when it comes to official languages, that the English language community in Quebec is not being mentioned? Anglophone, English-speaking community in Quebec. This morning, we heard testimony from representatives of the English-speaking community, and they said they were sorry to observe that they were not mentioned in the speech on the throne. Is this an oversight, some technical issue, or is this... Answer, no. Our policy on official languages is clear. We are investing making unequaled investments across the country to promote and celebrate both official languages in Canada, English and French, in every region, including Quebec. So how is it that in the budget there's no money for official languages? There is mention of it in the speech from the throne, but when you look in the budget per se, nowhere is there any mention. For example, the roadmap, there's no mention of this. Answer, well, today we're talking about our spending on official languages, some $337 million. In the speech from the throne, in our budget. I said, but it's in the budget? Yes. Yes, we're talking about it today. The reason I'm here, the reason I'm coming before you today is to talk about our funding in the budget for some $337 million to be spent on official languages. Thank you, Mr. Godin. We'll continue now with Ms. Glover. Thank you. Welcome again, Mr. Minister, and Madame Larocque, and Mr. Sobrino. It's a pleasure to see you again here. You mentioned the roadmap, Mr. Minister. We often talk here in the committee about the roadmap. And I'd like to know, since, again, this is a significant investment, $1.1 billion, that's $270 million more. So I'd like to know where we are at with this roadmap, and is it moving forward properly as expected? I'd like to hear your comments on the roadmap. Answer, first of all, I'd like to say that our roadmap was very well received by our partners, the provinces. All of the provinces are very happy, proud, committed to this project to promote, protect, and celebrate our official languages. Right now, more than 61% of the funding has been allocated and announced, which includes $788 million. This is money for to be spent in health and education, groups on the ground which provide services to new Canadians, for example, in the official language of their choice. And this is something that's very important. There are success stories, and they're very clear. Mr. Godin spoke briefly about the budget. This is a 5-year project we need to bear in mind, and we are very happy with the commitment and the success that we've already seen on this issue. Ms. Glover. And as we said, you were invited to participate for 2 hours, to testify for 2 hours. It's unfortunate that we didn't have this information at the time because the roadmap has done a great deal for official language minority communities, which includes, of course, the English-speaking community in Quebec. I'd like to know $260 million more. This figure is often quoted. What does that represent, $260 million in the roadmap? More than what? Answer, more than the former program, the Liberal government's program before the Conservative government. And the increase in funding is because, for us, we see Canada's 2 official languages as a true gift which must be cherished, celebrated, and it really does give us an advantage on the international scene and here in Canada as well. And so we'd like to invest in our youth. We've created a new track for the program, which includes money for artists. For example, in the Acadian region, we saw this in the Olympic and Paralympic Games, that official languages and culture go hand in hand with promoting official languages in Canada. So this is something that was made very clear for everyone who understood the importance of culture associated with official languages. We've created new programs, new funding for artists, and new funding for youth and for the educational system. So this is a 5-year commitment, an increase of 20% above and beyond the former program. And the success stories are clear, and we're very proud of what we've accomplished. I am, too, very proud, and I'd like to take advantage of your testimony here today to say that, yes, There were groups from the Francophone media who appeared last week. They had a lot to say with respect. They're happy, let's just say, with the changes they've seen within the department. And I can tell you that APF in particular issued a press release which said that funding for periodicals was extraordinary, and they truly believe that this will answer several challenges which exist. And this fund, what does this replace, this Canadian Periodical Fund? Answer, well, we decided to change the program and to ensure that funding was available for Francophone communities and newspapers in minority language settings. I often talk about the roadmap, but you also need to understand that in our government, there's other investments in addition to the roadmap. There's a media fund, there's support to newspapers, there's also funding for a number of measures which always include funding reserved for official languages. This is always the case based on government decisions. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Ms. Glover, says the chair. And now we will start the second round. We'll start with our vice chair, Mr. Bélanger. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Minister, Madam Deputy Minister, Mr. Sobrino. As regards the roadmap, we'll have an opportunity to discuss this more. I think we have to realize that the figures we're talking about barely take into account inflation. If you look at the beginning of the action plan to the roadmap, what's really happening is if we're asking communities, we're not giving them an increase, really. Mr. Minister, I'd like to come back to the issue of the Olympics. I'm happy that you recognize that at the opening ceremonies there was a problem. I myself would like to state that in terms of the organization and signage and announcements, everything was all well and good. But let's look at this situation a little deeper. What this reflects is a malaise or a problem, a national problem. The Olympic Games, yes, they were at Vancouver, but they were Canada's Games. I think we all agree on that, Mr. Minister. And what this reflects, what happens, reflects that Canada was treated like a utilitarian language with respect to, and as opposed to a language of identity, a community language, a cultural language, where what is expressed is a people, is a collective will. And here, Mr. Minister, this is where, as a Francophone, when I watched the opening ceremonies, I didn't identify with them. And I can imagine why, I understand why Premier Charest had his reaction. And I would like to congratulate you for your reaction when you said there wasn't enough French at the opening ceremonies. And this, I think, reflects this malaise that is not only found in the Olympics opening ceremonies, but something that we all recognize, that French, instead of becoming a language of identity, is becoming a service language or a language of utility. And you, as a Minister of Heritage, do you understand the significance of this problem? Answer, I understand the problem, and I agree, as I said, that we were sorry, but I completely reject what you're saying in regards that the French language being a service language at the Games. That's completely false. Were you on the ground at the Games in Vancouver? No, Mr. Minister. No, I watched them on television. Well, those people who were on the ground, both Francophones and Anglophones from across the country who came to Vancouver, there were more than 300,000 visitors in Vancouver. And what they saw was a great celebration of Canada's two official languages. Our investment, as I said, at the Place de la Francophonie, all of the volunteers. And when you look at the commitment made by this government, which we've tabled in the House, when we provide an additional $20 million in funding for VANOC, we listed out 15 specific things that we wanted to see on the ground, not just in terms of service, but in terms of celebrating Canada's official languages. And I can tell you that in the Atlantic House, Place de la Francophonie, that the volunteers, the events, everything was fully and completely bilingual, fully respecting and celebrating the French fact in Canada. So to say that the Olympic Games completely missed the boat, or that it was some sort of service language, I think that's very sad if that's your perception of the situation, because, in fact, that's completely false. Question, Mr. Minister, what I said was that in terms of signage and communications, the situation was fine. But where there were, when there were billions of television watchers, including some 31 million Canadians who, like myself, were not able to get to the games for one reason or another, what we saw there was not a reflection of Canada's biculturalism. The Minister, I disagree. There was a degree of penetration with the broadcasting as never before seen on television, and this was a big issue, a big topic with this committee. Will Francophone communities outside of Quebec be able to watch the games? These were the most bilingual games in the history of the Olympiad. This was a great success, and not just in terms of providing some service language. Mr. Minister, will agree to disagree on this issue, I think, because my perception with respect to the role of French was completely different. Well, mine is educated because I was on the field during the games, and I managed to speak with Francophones who attended the games, and when we watched them on television, RDS, all of the broadcasting all the broadcasters, CPAC, these are the most bilingual games in the history of the Olympic Games. In terms of communications, Mr. Minister, I will agree with you, but in terms of language, of identity, then I think there was a serious problem. Thank you, Mr. Bélanger.
We'll now continue with Ms. Gay. Thank you very much. Well, obviously, I'm pleased to see you here after the Olympic Games, Minister. And I'm glad to hear that you're always available to come back, because I'm sure we'll have other questions to put to you. Of course, one has to conduct a post-mortem after the Olympics. And I have to say, I was extremely disappointed by what I saw at the opening ceremonies. And I also heard a lot about it. Many people called me and told me that they were disappointed, that they didn't see themselves there. On the other hand, on the ground, I heard that things were working more or less well, that service was offered. Now, there were some complaints. There were people who were dissatisfied, and I think that has to be acknowledged. We can't just close our eyes to the fact, because then we can make sure that the next time this won't happen. When I look at what happened in Quebec City on the weekend, on Saturday, there were more than 150,000 people. There were Anglophones from all over Canada who were there. Nobody complained. Nobody complained that they weren't properly served. And service was provided in both languages. There wasn't a problem, and that was a pretty important event. It was an international event, and it worked well. Perhaps it can serve as an example in the future. Now, our concern is about local media and community radio stations. These people have been fighting for years. People in my own riding have been fighting for years. They're underfunded. They've often lost their buildings, their rooms. They've had to find space in various social groups, buildings. And this is happening more and more. So I'd like to hear assurances from you that these media, whether they be newspapers or community radios, that they'll be able to survive. They exist in my riding, and they're extremely important. A lot of people volunteer in those stations, but if they have nowhere to go, if they don't have a solid basis on which they can operate, they'll disappear. I'm aware of this issue and of the importance of this issue. I'm a former radio host myself from British Columbia. And I understand where 1.3% of the population is Francophone, that it's important. I have Francophone colleagues in Prince George. I know it's hard to get a population under 0 of francophones, but that is the population in St. George. And I know that it's important for community radio stations to be present. So I'm very aware of that issue. And I want to say that the first decision I made as Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages, and Mr. Bélanger is aware of this, was to speak about broadcasting here in Ottawa with the CRTC in order to make sure that the francophonie was well represented. So can you guarantee to us today that you will take care of this and you will ensure that community radio stations and community newspapers will be able to continue to survive? Well, I will do my best to ensure that funding goes in that direction. Thank you. Now, I noticed that you doubled the amount you're providing to TV5 Monde. That's interesting. It's one of my favorite stations, by the way. And it's a channel that other people are interested in. But I noticed also that you're providing a smaller amount, 10,000, or you're cutting by 10,000 the amount from 2,000 to 192,000 for what program are you talking about? It's a support for development of official language communities. And it's the main estimates for 2008-2009, where it was 2,000 and 2,000, and now for 2010 it's moving to 192,000. So you're cutting it by 10,000. So I'm wondering why those cuts are taking place. Well, I'm not aware. Perhaps someone else could answer. In the main estimates last year, it was $336 million for grants and contributions. And there was a $3.5 million decrease in grants and contributions. And so most of the money, $8 million, went into contributions for new funds for cultural development, and that also support the roadmap. So in fact, some money was taken out and put in somewhere else. So you're saying it was a transfer. Okay, I understand. Thank you, Ms. Guy. We'll now move on with Mr. Weston. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our committee, Minister. I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to put questions in French from a member for British Columbia to a minister from British Columbia. Now, last week, we heard from the Alliance de Radio Communautaire de Canada, and we also heard from the Association de Presse Francophone. We spoke about the Olympics. And I said that I was at the Olympics in Vancouver and Whistler, and that I was surprised by how the influence, the presence of the French language. Mr. François Côté is the Secretary General of the Alliance, and he said that the Franco-Media project was was a success, complete success, and it was magnificent for all communities and participants. It was an extraordinary experience for those participants who probably, for the first time in their life, were able to discover the Olympics and appreciate them in a different way. It was much more than just seeing the Olympics. It was an experience for them. And Mr. Côté said that according to all reports from the coordinators on the ground, it was an absolute success. So, Minister, what can we do with these success stories? What can we do with these success stories to help the French language flourish? Well, Franco-Media 2010 was a very important project for many reasons. we're always looking for key projects on the ground, not just big projects. Sometimes it's the small projects that can help young people, for example, become involved in official languages and speak both official languages throughout Canada in places where it may be more difficult to find these opportunities and jobs. And we also need to talk about the stories in communities. Sometimes one needs to talk about the stories in Anglophone communities in the Francophone press. So these are important things.
Media as a government with regard to official languages is to try to find these opportunities. I used to say all the time that it was a sad thing. I remember when I first got involved in politics. When you would see rallies, for example, in Quebec, where you would see young people so enthusiastic about Quebec leaving Canada. And they were talking about leaving a country that they had never seen, that they have never read about, that they'd never heard about, that they'd never had to report it on in their media because it wasn't available. Because when you have a tragedy, for example, say a shooting in Prince George, or if you have a great success like in Olympic Games, or if you have a great moment, all Canadians should know about that. All Canadians should know about our own shared experiences, our tragedies, our triumphs, our successes, our failures, our struggles. We should all know about this. But when there's that barrier of language between one region of the country and another, it doesn't help the future of this country if we don't get to have those shared experiences, good and bad. And so when you have like this project, the Projet Franco-Media 2010, the idea of this, again, is to take a few young kids who want to become reporters, give them a little bit of money, and let them talk about the Olympic Games and the things, not just the sporting aspects of the Games, but the adjacent events associated with the Games, the volunteers, the infrastructure things, the successes that were put in place, the things that matter on the ground that often don't get talked about, and to have that be told in French to Canadians from around the country, so that it's not just the filter of the official broadcasters of CTV, that you can get around that through different projects like this, so that we can have these shared experiences understood in both official languages. Too often, I mean, when we had the horrible floods in the province of Quebec about 10 years ago, it doesn't serve this country if people in Port Moody, where I'm from, can't witness that and experience that and understand it in their own language. We need to understand the tragedies and successes of other parts of the country. And when the barrier is language, the role of government, in our view, is to make investments into magazines, into media, into projects like this for kids, so that we can break down those barriers, so that we can have these shared experiences and bind ourselves together as a country.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Weston. On y est.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. Before moving on to Mr. Godin, I'd like, Minister, to give you an opportunity to comment on what Mr. Nadeau started speaking about. That is our meeting with representatives from the media in minority language communities and radio stations. Because they said that there are programs under Canadian Heritage, but when they go to other departments, they're referred back to Canadian Heritage. You see, all departments have to provide services in both languages. So I'd like you to comment on that. Well, unfortunately, this isn't a new concern and not without precedent. I'm aware of this issue, and we're working with our partners in other departments on this. Perhaps Judith can expand on this issue. Well, that is true. This is a perception that persists. But in the roadmap, about 15 departments were given funding, and they do have obligations that they have to meet. So all departments actually have to meet certain conditions. Now, here at Canadian Heritage, we try to play the role of champions for those departments, and we are happy to do so. But I often meet groups, whether that to be in the health sector or otherwise, in managing to make contact with other departments. Now, we're happy to be the champions amongst the departments, but when I hear that there is a problem, then I call my counterparts in the other departments to talk about it. So this is a perception that persists. It continues. We'll continue to try and correct that perception. But it is true that that still is a daily perception. Thank you. Mr. Godin. Minister, you said that all Canadians were able to see the Olympics. Well, that's not true, and I'll tell you why. Channel V does not exist throughout Canada. RDS is not provided on all satellites or television stations. And the same is true of CPAC. So there are places in Canada where CPAC is not broadcast, and they don't have to. Can you give me an example? I'll give you an example. In Northern Ontario, there are regions where they don't get CPAC, and you could check that, and perhaps check that CPAC does not have to be broadcast. And there are also many people who are on the road. They live out of a suitcase in hotels. CPAC is not in hotels, nor is Channel V. And RDS, it may not be either. Sometimes it is. And so people have not received 100% access. Now, what I am pleased to hear is this. You said that it's good that people in Quebec be made aware of what's happening in British Columbia via television. Are you talking about judges? Is that where you're going? No, I'll say what I have to say. You have very good soldiers there who are standing up for judges and who are also providing misinformation, but anyway. Now, the only one able to provide information throughout the country is, and Channel V can't do that. Let's just be clear on that. Channel V doesn't have to do that, but Radio-Canada does have a mandate. So what do you have to say about CRTC's recent decision to exclude Radio-Canada? Now, perhaps there's a good reason. Perhaps you don't want, perhaps you feel that Radio-Canada should be allowed to withdraw. And perhaps you don't want others to withdraw. I want to understand. I want to know how the government is going to support Radio-Canada and to ensure that if there's any funding issue, and that's actually what they were talking about on the news last night, well, perhaps you should call Conrad von Finkelstein, the president of the CRTC, before your committee to talk about that as a witness, because he could answer those questions. He was the one who made the decision. Radio-Canada and CBC, as far as I'm concerned, are very, very important for the reasons I already stated. Without Radio-Canada in Vancouver, there would be no broadcaster there. They're the third largest province. And they're becoming a more and more diverse province, and so it's important to protect the francophonie. Well, I was listening to CTV when the torch arrived in Vancouver, and because Radio-Canada was not in the agreement, they weren't broadcasting it. So there was no one broadcasting it. So Canadians did not all Canadians saw this. Yes, but these Olympics were the most televised Olympics in history. I know it's not perfect. Yes, but you earlier said 100% of Canadians had access. Well, it was the most available Olympics, whether that be electronically or through the media. And of course it wasn't perfect. And there have been criticisms of CTV, and many of those criticisms are well-founded. All right, let's move on to communities. We heard that there's less red tape, and I want to congratulate you on there being less red tape. But now let's talk about money. Will the money follow in time, or will these communities have to once again use their own credit cards to get the money they need? Well, of course we don't want that to happen. We don't want to see organizations doing that, key organizations for Francophone communities. We don't want that ever to happen. And that's why we listen to their concerns. And we always try to seek the best way to ensure that funding is spent and allocated effectively and responsibly to meet the needs of these organizations. And we changed that 50% rule. That will continue as a policy. We are aware that there are concerns, and we're trying to find a way to meet those concerns. So if they're wondering what has happened with their program, what do I say to those people who are wondering where that program is? Well, we're halfway there. We'll be publishing our service standards on the 1st of April on our website. So that will provide a certain amount of certainty for our clients, and we're also working with them to get the checks out. I think 80% of them have received confirmation that they will be receiving that funding, but that's not enough. We also have to get the checks out as quickly as possible while exercising due diligence. And we'll also be using direct deposit. So we're trying to update our methods. Thank you, Mr. Godin. And I'm sure you'll be reacting to the recommendations from this committee on the delay of payments. But this wraps up our meeting. Thank you, Minister, for coming today. Thank you to your colleagues. Thank you to you all.
Hey.